Welcome back to Inhibition. Today's topic, critical race theory. It's time we expose the truth and talk about what this is, and is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? We're going to break down the details. It's time we talk about it. Alright, thank you so much for joining me today. So glad you're with me. We're going to jump right into the topic, but before we do, if you're interested in conservative topics and politics and things in the news from a conservative viewpoint, go ahead and click that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, like this video, and let's jump into it. Critical race theory, what exactly is it? That's something that people have been talking about. It's been in the news. There's been videos, viral videos of parents going to school board meetings talking about critical race theory. There's been people defending critical race theory, people coming out against it, and a lot of people don't actually know what it is. So we're going to break down some of the core components of critical race theory, break it down not just from opinion, but from what the actual founders, the people who created this, what they say about it. We're going to break it down, see exactly what it is. So let's jump into it. So first of all, what is CRT or critical race theory? It originated in the 1970s by legal scholars including Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, and Alan Freeman. Those were the three main people who kind of formulated this idea of critical race theory. Now, there were others involved, many other different scholars involved that jumped in and included and helped develop critical race theory, but it was really these three that were the primary scholars involved in critical race theory. It started in the field of legal studies, but then it expanded into education, political science, ethnic studies, and ultimately American studies. So it expanded to other fields, but it started as a legal theory and then kind of went from there. Now, like I said, it was Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, and Alan Freeman. This was Derek Bell, and this is Richard Delgado, and this is Alan Freeman. These are the three men who were primarily responsible for the formulation of this critical race theory. Now, critical race theory, we'll talk about it in just a moment. It was born out of something else called critical theory, and that started before, but these men took that and created critical race theory out of it. And so these are the three men primarily responsible for critical race theory. What is CRT? So there was a book written by Richard Delgado, which is one of those three men, along with a woman named Jean Stefanchik, and they define critical race theory movement in their book called A Critical Race Theory and Introduction. They define the critical race theory movement as a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. Power being the key word there, you'll see that in just a moment. Specifically, critical race theory is an academic concept that provides a framework for examining systemic racism and how cultural perceptions of race have affected people in this country from slavery all the way to the present time. Now, the key then, the reason I said the key word was power, is because in the context of critical race theory, it's not just talking about your version of racism that you might think of, like, you know, a racist person who uses the N-word and says bad things about black people and thinks they are superior to black people. That's an individual. That's a single person. But critical race theory doesn't really deal with individual ideas like that. It is more of a systemic issue, something that is in the system. It is believing that the system, everything in culture, and we'll look at this more deeply in just a moment, but is steeped in racism. And so we'll see it's systemic. It's part of the system. So we'll look at that in just a moment. Now, I said critical race theory was actually born out of something called critical theory, which actually is an approach to social philosophy that focuses on reflective assessment and critique of society and culture in order to reveal and challenge power structures. Power structures being the idea of those in authority or structures of power that hold another group of people down. And critical theory originates in sociology and literary criticism and argues that social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than by individuals and psychological factors. That it is societal structures and cultural assumptions that create and prop up these power structures that then oppress another group of people. So critical race theory is specifically dealing with that concept in race, but critical theory predates critical race theory, and you'll see in just a moment what critical theory really talked about in context to the oppression of a group. But critical theory maintains that ideology is the principal obstacle to human liberation, that the wrong thinking and this wrong ideology is an obstacle to human liberation. Critical theory was established as a school of thought primarily by the Frankfurt School theoreticians such as Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, and Max Horkheimer. Horkheimer actually described a theory as critical insofar as it seeks to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. The idea that there are power structures oppressing a group of humans, and that group of humans is trying to be liberated from that oppression. You can kind of begin to see the concept of how they modified this to be critical race theory, talking about people being oppressed who are of certain race groups. But here's the key. Critical theory, which predates critical race theory, it's what critical race theory was born out of, has ties to Marxism. In sociology and political philosophy, critical theory means the Western Marxist philosophy of the Frankfurt School, developed in Germany in the 1930s and drew on the ideas of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. The ideas of Karl Marx is what critical theory was actually originally, back in the 1930s, developed from. So people who say critical race theory is Marxist, and people will be like, how is it Marxist? We'll see how it's Marxist when we get into its core components. But first and foremost, it was born out of Marxism. It was born out of this critical theory, which was a Marxist idea. Marx explicitly developed the notion of critique into the critique of ideology, linking it with the practice of social revolution. As stated in the 11th section of the Theses of Feuerbach, I might be pronouncing that completely bad, but he said, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. So his idea was that philosophy and interpreting the world in a certain way is not good enough, that you have to go further in the notion of critique, to go further and change it. It's revolution. He tied it with the practice of social revolution. And so Marxism, and this concept of social revolution, it ties to the critical theory idea was that there was a group of people being oppressed, the workers, being oppressed by the bourgeoisie, and this whole concept of Marx, this whole concept of communism and Marxism was tied into critical theory. Critical race theory builds upon the same philosophy. So yes, critical race theory, in definition, by the nature of its own premises and where it came from, develops out of Marxism. Now we'll get more into details on that in just a moment, and you'll see where kind of those Marxist ideas come from, but it absolutely is tied to Marxism. No matter, people will try to say it has nothing to do with communism. People will try to argue that you're just calling everybody communist that you disagree with. No, it literally has ties to Marxism. Now here's the thing, we're going to look at specifically in this video some specific tenets of critical race theory. And so I'm going to list them here, and then we're going to start breaking some of these down. So first of all, there's this concept that racism is ordinary and not aberrational.
There's racists everywhere! They're everywhere!
It's ordinary. It's the ordinary experience of people, of specifically black people or people of color in this country. It's our normal way of life in our society. It's the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. So it's not something that's just hit or miss. There might be some racist people out there. No, it is the ordinary. It is the common way of life for every person of color in this country. Also, there's this idea of interest convergence. We'll talk about how basically the idea of this is that the system is going to serve the purpose of the dominant group. So basically anything that happens, it's going to serve the interest of white people. We'll look at that more in depth in just a moment. Critical race theory is also against liberalism and free society. Now, when I say liberalism, I don't mean liberalism as in Democrats versus Republicans, like the liberals versus conservatives. I mean liberalism in the classic sense of classic liberalism, freedom, liberty, where that word actually comes from. Critical race theory is actually against that, and we'll see that. That's where some of that Marxism idea comes in. We'll see that in just a moment. Also, within critical race theory, individualism does not exist.
We are bored.
You are not an individual. And we're going to look at that in just a moment, a little bit more in depth. And then finally, there's two here kind of put together. Critical race theory is actually anti-science. And a lot of people don't realize this. But I'll explain why and what they say about science in critical race theory. But it focuses on, and this is kind of the other side of the coin from anti-science, it focuses on storytelling and counter storytelling. So the idea is narrative, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But let's start breaking some of these down, and let's see exactly what critical race theory says about each of these tenets. And these are just some that I picked out. There's other tenets of critical race theory that you can break down, but I just picked a few of the core components. So let's talk about racism is ordinary and not aberrational, that specific idea. So this concept that racism is ordinary. So this is a quote from Critical Race Theory, an introduction written by Richard Delgado, remember one of the founders or the creators of Critical Race Theory, and Gene Stefanchik, and it says first that racism is ordinary, not aberrational. Normal science, the usual way society does business, the common, everyday experience of most people of color in this country. And that's in Critical Race Theory, an introduction on page 7 of that book. Now, that is a statement, that is a foundational principle to critical race theory. It's ordinary. It's not aberrational. It's not something that just happens occasionally. This is every day. In other words, this black woman right here in this picture, she lives with racism daily. That her daily, everyday experience is racism. She battles racism every single day. In contrast, this white woman right here, she lives with privilege daily. That she doesn't experience that racism, that she is the privileged, and the black girl at the top, she is experiencing racism and is the oppressed. And it is the white girl's fault that the girl at top there experiences racism, because the white girl promotes racism and is a racist. And we'll see how that works all out in just a moment. So racism, however, we need to make sure that we explain racism. When it says racism is the common experience for black people in this country, they're not saying racism as in prejudice based upon race or believing some races to be superior or inferior to others. But that's the common definition of racism, which prior to critical race theory was the only definition of racism. That's what racism was. But no, that's not what they mean by racism. What they mean by racism is that the system of everything that happens in the social world and beyond that results in any disparity that works in the favor of racially privileged groups on average, or any racially oppressed person claiming that they experience racial oppression.
It's a rigged system. It's a crooked system, a corrupt and crooked system.
That is what they mean by racism. It's systemic racism, not just, somebody being prejudiced or thinking one race is superior or inferior to another. It is the entire system of everything that results in any disparity. So if someone who is white gets a job and someone who is black does not get the job, no matter what the reason is claimed as to why that happened, it is racism. It's because of race. That person was oppressed because they are not white, and the white person got the job because they are privileged. That is how critical race theory views racism. These assumptions lead people who take up critical race theory to look for racism in everything until they find it. That's, after all, the whole job of a critical theorist or activist, is to look for the hidden problems that they assume must be present in whatever they scrutinize. In other words, critical race theorists believe that there is racism in everything. So if racism is in everything in all of the social world, if there is racism, then if they don't see the racism, they will look until they find something that they can call racism because they believe it's there. They can't just say, oh, well, maybe there wasn't actually racism in this scenario. No, they believe racism is there every single day in every single encounter when there's different racial groups, and therefore they look for the racism. The second tenet that we talked about was interest convergence, and now this one's a little bit different. Let's talk about this one for a moment. So the idea of interest convergence is that white people only give black people opportunities and freedoms when it's also in their own interest.
What's in it for me?
In other words, if you're a white person, you're only going to help a black person or give them some kind of opportunity or freedom if it serves your own interest. And so this is the idea of interest convergence, that you only help black people when it converges with your own interest. So in other words, this woman here, who is a white woman, she's inherently racist. That inherent from the time of birth, she is racist. She's born that way. There's nothing that can change her. She is indeed racist. And because she is inherently racist, she will not help black people. She is fine with black people being oppressed unless for some reason it benefits her to fight against that racism. That's the idea of interest convergence. In other words, it kind of works like this. The white elites and working class, they are being propped up or held up by racism. Racism is benefiting the white elites and working class. They're being propped up by racism. Racism, of course, in turn, is pushing down non-white people. But because racism is building up white elites and working class, it's hard to get the white elites and the white working class to fight against racism, because racism is building them up. It's profiting them. It's helping them. And therefore, white people who are inherently racist aren't going to fight against racism. However, the only time they would fight against racism is when fighting against racism would help lift them up even more. So if it lifts the white elites and the working class white people up, then it will fight against racism, but only in the sense that it's promoting white people, which is creating more power structures, which is still pushing non-white people down. And so even when you fight racism, you're actually creating more racism, which is still hurting non-white people. And you're born that way. There's nothing you can do. You're just racist. That's who you are as a white person. Critical race theory demands that everyone should be anti-racist. Now, here's where you can start to see the problem, right? Critical race theory demands that everyone shouldn't just be not racist. They should be anti-racist. They should fight against racism. But if someone with racial privilege, including white, Asian, Hispanic, Arab, Indian, or even lighter-skinned black people, anyone who could be perceived as having racial privilege, if they decide to become an anti-racist, the interest convergence thesis says that they only did so to make themselves look good, to protect themselves from criticism, or to avoid confronting their own racism. The academic literature on whiteness studies is filled with this notion. It's the idea that white people only fight racism because they're trying to make themselves look good, or for their own benefit, or to lift them up. The academic literature is filled with this, including Good White People. It's published in 2018 by the State University of New York Press. And the whole notion is that there are no good white people, that white people only do good things on occasion because it builds them up, and it's for self-interest.
All white people are racist. You're always going to be racist, actually. I believe that white people are born into not being human.
You can kind of see the problem with this. The interest convergence thesis makes it literally impossible for anyone with racial privilege, as outlined by critical race theory, to do anything right, because anything they do right must also have been self-interested. If critical race theory makes a demand of people with any form of racial privilege and they comply, they just make themselves more complicit in racism. In other words, if you do anything to be anti-racist and you're white, that just means you're racist. That's the logic of the interest convergence thesis, which is a tenet of critical race theory. In other words, white people can do nothing. You are born racist. You will remain racist for the rest of your life. You are trash, is what critical race theory teaches. By giving people no way out, critical race theory becomes deeply manipulative and unable to be satisfied in its list of demands. You can see the problem here. Basically, there's a racist white person, but let's say they have an awakening and they decide to be anti-racist and they help non-white people. Well, they must be doing it for their own benefit, to build themselves up and they're using and manipulating black people so therefore they're a racist white person. And it's just it's circular reasoning. There's no escape. You will always end up back being the racist white person. That's the interest convergence thesis. It's a tenet of critical race theory. Tenet number 3, it's against liberalism and a free society.
That you crave subjugation. The bright lure of freedom diminishes your life's joy in a mad scramble for power.
Critical race scholars are discontent with liberalism as a framework for addressing America's racial problems. Many liberals believe in colorblindness and neutral principles of constitutional law. That was written in an introduction to critical race theory by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik on page 21. It explicitly says that critical race scholars are discontent with liberalism as a framework for addressing the problems because they believe in colorblindness. This is so crazy. It says if you believe in colorblindness, if you believe that you don't see color, I don't see black people and white people, I see one race, the human race, well, you're promoting racism by doing that. Because in their mind, racism is a natural, ordinary part of life. And if you say that you don't see race and you just believe in one race, the human race, and you're colorblind, then you are not acknowledging the experience that black people go through, making you therefore racist. Look at this quote. These movements initially advocated for a type of liberal humanism, which includes individualism, freedom, and peace, but quickly turned to a rejection of liberal humanism. Critical race theory movement initially advocated for a type of liberal humanism, but quickly turned into rejection of it. Rejection of individualism, freedom, and peace. The ideal of individual autonomy, which is the ability in yourself to make your own choices and to be free, that underlies liberal humanism, was viewed as a mechanism for keeping the marginalized in their place by obscuring larger structural systems of inequality. In other words, it fooled people into believing they have more freedom and choice than societal structures actually allow. This is from a book by Is Everyone Really Equal? On page 5 by Robin DiAngelo and Özlem Sensoy. Robin DiAngelo is a well-known critical race theorist, wrote the book White Fragility, which was a big book in the culture recently. And the idea here is that the critical race theory initially advocated for individualism, freedom, and peace, but rejected it when this idea of individual freedom, they believed, obscured larger structural systems of inequality. In other words, the whole system is racist, and if you claim that individuals have, individual choice, well, now it sounds like you're saying that black people could make different choices that could rise them out of the affliction that they find themselves in, and that can't happen because the system is racist. So they turned against this idea of free choice, that free choice is not a thing and it shouldn't be a thing, and you'll see why in just a moment. In other words, critical race theory sees free societies and ideals that make them work, such as individualism, freedom, and peace, as a kind of conspiracy theory that we all participate in for the purpose of keeping racial minorities down. That you celebrating individualism, freedom, and peace, it doesn't actually exist, but you're pretending it does as a conspiracy theory, and you're doing that so as a way to keep racial minorities down by saying, well, if they're free, if they would just make different choices, they'd be better off, so it's just a way to keep black people down. When its advocates accuse people of being complicit in systems of racism, it's part of what they mean. Obviously, they would prefer we don't have free societies and would rather arrange society as they see fit and make us all go along with our ideas. That we shouldn't have free societies, we can't say that it's individual choice, take away individual choice because this isn't really about individual choice, and we should just set up society the way that critical race theory says it should be set up. Number 4, individualism itself doesn't exist. So the idea of individualism doesn't exist. This is a quote from Critical Race Theory, an introduction by Richard Delgado. It says, a third theme of critical race theory, the social construction thesis, holds that race and races are products of social thought and relations. not objective, inherent, or fixed. They correspond to no biological or genetic reality. Rather, races are categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. So they say that race has no inherent, objective, biological, or genetic reality. It's not because you actually have more melanin in your skin if you're a black person. No, it's just a social construct that we've created to label people. So we can use it as a category and we can manipulate it. And then that's the reality, that there is no individual, like your individual reality, your biology, your genetics has nothing to do with it. We've created groups that you are involved in society. This is a white person, but you have to be understood in terms of the social groups you inhabit, because these are social groups and we've created them, and that's just the way society is. You cannot be reviewed as an individual. This gentleman here at this table, it doesn't matter what his name is, what he does for a living, his background, none of that matters. He's a white man. That's all that matters.
Straight white male, hate myself, mad that my skin's so pale.
You have these groups, like here's a group of black people. It's part of the black community, or the black group here. These are black people, and these are white people. Completely different groups. Your individuality doesn't matter. You're a part of a group. You have the LGBTQIA plus group here. You have women. They're in a group. And there's this term that you may hear called intersectionality. Intersectionality is the place where you're in these different groups and those places where they intersect.
I'm gay, I'm trans, I'm Asian, I'm overweight, I'm lower class, I'm unintelligent, unattractive.
Wonderful sunshine. That's 13 privilege points.
So you may be LGBTQIA and black and a woman. And if you fall within all three of those categories, the place where those three categories intersect, that's intersectionality. And that's this idea that the more oppressed groups you're in, the more oppressed you are. And it's like this, I've heard someone use the phrase victim Olympics. It's like, who can be the biggest victim? What categories can I fall into to be the biggest victim? Again, it doesn't matter about your individual circumstances. It just matters about the groups you fall into, because individualism doesn't exist. And then critical race theory labels these groups. So if you're in the black group, you are oppressed. If you're in the LGBTQIA plus group, you're oppressed. If you're in the women's group, you're oppressed. If you're in the white group, you're privileged. If you're in the male group, you're privileged. And wherever you are and you fall in these, some groups are privileged, some groups are oppressed. And all that matters is your group identity. It doesn't matter about individuals. So if I were to point out individuals in the black group or LGBTQIA group or the women's group who were successful and were not oppressed, doesn't matter, because individuals don't exist. We're talking about your group identity, and the group is oppressed, which means you are oppressed because you're part of that group. So for example, we can see here in the black community here, we have Obama and we have Oprah Winfrey and we have all these people who are successful, Damon Jones, and all these people who are successful within the black community. And the two people down there in the bottom right in the black group there, that's the founders of BET. And so we can see here, they're privileged. No, even though they're billionaires and millionaires and they've got money and they're living extremely successful lives, it doesn't matter, because they're part of the black group, which means they are oppressed. Down there in the LGBTQIA, we have extremely, Ellen and extremely successful people, but it doesn't matter, they're oppressed because they're in that group. Or the women's group, Kamala Harris, who's the vice president of the United States. She's oppressed. Michelle Obama, they're oppressed because they not only are women, but in intersectionality, they also fall under people of color, and now they're not white, and so they're even more oppressed. And then you've got successful entrepreneurs who are women and amazing things. And then up there in the white category, even though these people are, poor and living in, their homes are run down, they're living in very bad conditions in trailer parks and don't have money and are very poor and are just trying to make ends meet and getting food given to them donated to them because they have no food, they're in the white community, so they're privileged. Compare them to Michelle Obama or Barack Obama or Oprah Winfrey. Nope. Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey, they're oppressed. These white people who are living poor, they're privileged. Because individual circumstances don't matter. There is no such thing as individualism in critical race theory. It is your association with your group that matters. This idea of I look to a day when people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Martin Luther King said that.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Amazing man, amazing ideology, and that quote, which is something we celebrate in this country, the day that we'll not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. That is an incredible dream. And Martin Luther King stood up and said, I have a dream. But that is not a dream that critical race theory likes. To critical race theory, that's bad. You shouldn't be judged by the content of your individual character. It's the color of your skin. It's the group you're associated with that you're judged by. If you're a black person, you shouldn't be judged by the content of your character. You are a black person and you should be judged by the fact that you are a black person and therefore are oppressed. White people should not be judged by the content of their character. They should be judged by the color of their skin. They're white, therefore they are racists. And there is no getting around it because they are white. This concept of removing individualism is absolutely terrible. You can even see this in a writing by Lynn Lemisko on page 193 of Educator to Educator, another education manual in critical social justice programs. And again, using that word critical, it's linking this critical race theory. This is what they write. If democracy is about individual rights, justice for individuals, then social justice is about group rights, justice for groups. And for me, there is a fundamental difference between the general notion of justice and the notion of social justice. And there is a huge difference. Social justice, which is what everybody's pushing for right now, is for justice for the group you associate with and not just for you as an individual. Justice for you as an individual is, let's say you rob a bank. Justice for you as an individual is you go before a jury of your peers, the evidence is presented, and the only question is, did you do it? If you did, justice is you being punished for that crime. Social justice is, and obviously it doesn't work exactly like this in practicality, but this is the principle behind it. That same person who robbed that bank, you go before a jury, and social justice would be, why did this person do this? Were they a part of an oppressed group that caused them to be down and out and would explain why they did this? Social justice is looking for the fact that you're part of a group, and if your group is oppressed, you can't be held accountable. That is absolutely a perversion of justice. Anything you add before justice perverts justice. So it's just because it uses the word justice doesn't mean it actually is justice. It's not. Tenet number 5 is being anti-science or storytelling. And this is the last one we're going to deal with in this video. But being anti-science...
Science is a liar sometimes.
Or storytelling. Since modern science was predominantly produced by white Western men, critical race theory therefore views science as a white and Western way of knowing. They view science as a white way of knowing. Critical race theory therefore maintains that science encodes and perpetuates white dominance and thus isn't really fitting for black people who inhabit a culture of blackness. This is anti-science. See, Delgado and Stefanchik said that normal science is a part of everyday, ordinary racism of our societies. This is because critical race theory, using that social construction thesis, believes that the power and politics of cultural groups make their way intrinsically into everything that culture produces. Science is just politics by other means to critical race theory. Robin DiAngelo and Özlem Şensoy write, one of the key contributions of critical theorists concerns the production of knowledge. Given that the transmission of knowledge is an integral activity in schools, critical scholars in the field of education have been especially concerned with how knowledge is produced. These scholars argue that a key element of social injustice involves the claim that particular knowledge is objective, neutral, and universal. An approach based on critical theory calls into question the idea that objectivity is desirable or even possible. The term used to describe this way of thinking about knowledge is that knowledge is socially constructed. When we refer to knowledge as socially constructed, we mean that knowledge is reflective of the values and interests of those who produce it. To simplify what Robin DiAngelo is saying here, they're saying a couple of things. Number one, they are saying that there's this argument that objectivity, being objective, that something like science, for example, that is objective, it's neutral, and it's universal in the sense, universality in science, for example, it doesn't matter who does the study, who does the tests, the labs, whoever does the experiment, it will produce the same results because it's objective, right? Gravity is gravity, and it doesn't matter who picks up the pin and drops the pin's going to fall every time because gravity is objective. It is what it is. That's science, but they say no, objectivity is not even something that's desirable, let alone it's not even possible. The term they use for thinking about knowledge is that it's socially constructed. The knowledge come from the society and not from science and objectivity. And they also talk about knowledge is constructed or reflective of the values and interests of those who produce it. Since most of science has been produced by white people throughout history, science therefore reflects the interest of white people and therefore doesn't speak to black people, doesn't help black people. And that's absolutely insane. Science is not like that. That's not how science works. That's not how the scientific method works. But that's the teaching of critical race theory. It demolishes science. So Şensoy and DiAngelo claim that science presumes the superiority and infallibility of the scientific method, and therefore we should be asking whose rationality and whose presumed objectivity underlines the scientific method. In other words, they say the scientific method was created by white people, and therefore it's white people's rationality that underlies the scientific method and therefore can't be trusted. White people are inherently evil, as we've already found out. Then, even more cynically, they insist that we must ask whose interests are served by science, as though that's the relevant question asked of a universalist method. Scientific method's universalist. It helps everybody. Again, it's objective. It is what it is. But they don't believe that anything could truly be objective because they believe individuality doesn't exist and everything comes from this social constructs. Everything is socially constructed, and therefore there is no such thing as true objectivity. And so they assume that anything that comes out of science is just more racism benefiting the white person. Do you see how dangerous critical race theory is yet? This isn't just about being, racism's bad. The way they're defining racism and the way that they're applying it to everything in society is dangerous. Critical race theory falsely asserts that white people's interests are primarily served by science. First of all, that's wrong. And second of all, it's racist. But third of all, it's dangerous. For it's funny that the people who are claiming to be pro-science are supporting a educational theory that is anti-science, and then calling those who stand against critical race theory and people who are primarily on the conservative side, calling them anti-science. It's absolutely laughable. Basically, they say science serves white people. But science serves white people. Outside of science, science can't be trusted for true knowledge because science serves white people. So if knowledge doesn't come from science, according to critical race theory, or at least knowledge that is true and that fits what they say, where does it come from? Well, since black people aren't suited to or served by science, which is absolutely racist to say, Delgado and Stefanczyk say that storytelling about their lived experience is the primary mode by which black people and critical race theory produce to and advance knowledge. That it is storytelling and lived experience. It's me telling you my lived experience that produces knowledge. Not science, not facts and objectivity, but my subjective view of what I've experienced. That creates knowledge. But not everybody's storytelling, not everybody's subjective view, but only the lived experiences that agree with critical race theory. And if something disagrees with critical race theory, that lived experience, it's a lie. It's part of white culture. And it's not true because white people are inherently evil, right? So if it was Ben Carson's lived experience, his narrative, it doesn't fit their narrative. So he's supporting, even though he's black, he's supporting the white narrative, which is a lie and manipulative and evil. And he's supporting white power structures. So he's a traitor to his own race. He'll be labeled a Uncle Tom or a coon because those are racist terms. He's betrayed his own people because he's just supporting white people. He's a white supremacist even though he's black, because it's the narrative that matters, and his narrative is supporting the white narrative, and the white people are evil. If it's Colonel Allen West, if it's Tim Scott, if it's Larry Elder, if it's Candace Owens, Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas, if it's Brandon Tatum, if it's any of those black people, nope, they are traitors to their own race, and they are supporting the white narrative. And so they are not actually expressing their true lived experience. No, they are betraying their own race and promoting a white lie of what the lived experience is. They're promoting white privilege, and therefore they're white supremacists. If it's these black people, nope, their lived experience and their story doesn't work because it's a lie. It's just the white people. They've been manipulated by the white man, and white people, they're repeating the white lived experience. If it's these black people, or these black people, or if it's these black people, nope, their lived experience is a lie. It doesn't matter. Do you see the inherent racism of critical race theory? It says if you're black and you don't agree with me, then you aren't really black. You're promoting white people. You just want to be white. You're what people will call a house Negro, and that those racist terms are disgusting, but they're spread by people who claim to be anti-racist, who support critical race theory. It's disgusting. Critical race theorists have built on everyday experiences with perspective, viewpoint, and the power of stories and persuasion to come to a better understanding of how Americans see race. They have written parables, autobiography, and counter stories, and have investigated the factual background and personalities frequently ignored in the casebooks of well-known cases. This is Critical Race Theory, an introduction on page 38 by Richard Delgado and Stefanczyk. The idea is it's built on experience and perspective and storytelling, parables. It's not built on science. Science you can't trust. It's built on storytelling. Saying that science is a way of knowing for white Western people, especially men, and storytelling is one more suited to racial minorities, is itself racist. You're saying black people can't be objective and understand science, and that black people couldn't break through into scientific discovery, that all science has always been white people, which is denying black scientists who have been there through the history of science. This happens in multiple ways. It undermines the capacity of black people for critical thinking. It teaches them to see the world in an us versus them way that oppresses them. It associates associating them with harmful negative stereotypes that rigorous methods are what white people and not black people use. These are all racist ideas. Critical race theory in and of itself is racist. So what we've learned about critical race theory, it's racist, it's Marxist, and it's anti-science. This is why we stand against critical race theory, not because we're white people who want to oppress black people, but because critical race theory in and of itself is an evil ideology. It is racist, it is Marxist, it's anti-science, it's dangerous. This is why we stand against critical race theory. I hope you've enjoyed this breakdown of critical race theory. There's a lot more on critical race theory. We'll talk more about it in future videos. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you stay up to date. Comment down below about your opinion on some of this. Was this new information? Is there something else about critical race theory you want to bring up? Put it down in the comments below. Be more than happy to continue the conversation. Let's talk about it. Until next time.
Thanks so much for watching. For more videos, click subscribe and hit that notification bell. And if you enjoyed the video, click that like button. See you next time.